Hello students, you're welcome to today's class. In today's literature class, we'll be looking at the poem The Grieved Lands of Africa by the poet Agostinho Neto. Before we start, we're going to look at a brief background of the poem to understand the poem, to understand why the poet wrote the poem and what informed him, what inspired him to write the poem. Before we get there, let's look at the objectives of the lesson. By the end of the lesson, we are expected to identify the background and setting of the poem and relate it to the meaning of the poem. Then we are also expected to be able to discuss the themes of the poem, that is to know the thematic import of the poem and relate it to the meaning of the poem as well. Another thing is to analyze the use of figurative devices in the poem and also show its relevance or their relevance to the meaning of the poem. Now the background. We are looking at the poem The Grieved Lands of Africa, written by Agostinho Neto. Agostinho Neto is an Angolan poet and also a politician. Agostinho Neto was a prominent figure in the fight against the colonial rule in Angola. He was one of those who protested and fought for independence in Angola. In fact, even in his fight for independence, he was among those who were jailed or imprisoned during the fight until Angola gained its independence. It is recorded that Angola is one of the countries that gained their independence in Africa through war. Now let's look at the poem. Look at the content analysis of the poem. Let's look at the poem stanza by stanza and analyze it stanza by stanza. Stanza 1, it says, "The grieved lands of Africa, in the tearful woes of ancient and modern slave, in the degrading sweat of impure dance, of other seas, grieved." In this stanza 1, the poet is talking about or referring to the ancient and modern slavery in Africa. That is, the slavery that took place hundreds of years before even the colonial imperialism in Angola. He looks at how Africans were enslaved during the time of slavery, how they were bought and shipped to European countries and were used as workers in the farms for European farmers. How even after this, many years after this, these colonial masters or these Europeans still came down to Africa and enslaved us all in the name of colonialism. They conquered the lands of Africa and enslaved us, used us for their own benefits. It also looks at how the European countries scrambled for the countries of Africa, and partitioned these countries to the different states in the European world. It also continues, it says, "In the degrading sweat of impure dance." So during this colonial imperialism, these European masters or European people colonized Africans and subjected them to dehumanizing situations just for their own selfish interests. Now, these dehumanizing situations, they disguise as colonialism. They disguise as conquest. So now these are people that came from other countries. These Europeans came to colonize Africa. Moving forward in stanza 2, he says, "The grieved lands of Africa, in the infamous sensation of the stunning perfume of the flower, crushed in the forest by the wickedness of iron and fire, the grieved lands." The stunning perfume of the flower here refers to the natural resources in Africa. Now, what he's saying here is that the natural resources in Africa was what attracted these colonial imperialists. They came to Angola, they came to Africa, they came to African lands, conquered Africa, and then exploited and explored the lands of Africa all to their own selfish interests. Now he moves further to say, crushed in the forest. So in a bid to conquer Africa, they enslaved, they used violence. So this crushed to the forest, that line, crushed in the forest, refers to the use of violence. Refers to the use of violence and force to conquer or gain entry into the lands of Africa. By the wickedness of iron and fire. By the wickedness of iron and fire here refers to the use of violence such as ammunition, the use of guns, the use of lethal weapons to gain entry into the lands of Africa. So he continues by saying that the lands of Africa grieved. They grieve this colonialism, they grieve this frustration, they grieve the fact that their rights were taken away from them, they grieve the fact that they do not have the power to say, they do not have the right to say, they do not have the power to do what they want in their own lands. Whatever right they have, whatever little right they had been taken away from them by these foreign people, by these foreign colonial masters, by these people from other lands. Now, they did this all in a bid to export the resources in Africa to their own lands. In stanza 3, it says, the grieved lands of Africa, in the dream soon undone, in jiggling of jailers' keys, and in the stifled laughter and victorious voice of lament, and in the unconscious brilliance of hidden sensations of the grieved lands of Africa. Again, if you look at stanza 3, you see that the poet repeated the line, the grieved lands of Africa. This repetition is used to reinforce the message that the land of Africa, the lands of Africa grieve. The lands of Africa are in pain. The lands of Africa are in sorrows. They are in pains. Why are they in pain? They are in pain because what they have has been taken away from them forcefully. He says, in the dream soon undone, in jingling of jailers' keys. This line refers to how most of the people who protested, who fought for independence during the time of colonialism in the then Angola and maybe other lands in Africa, other countries in Africa, were imprisoned, they were jailed, they were incarcerated. Those who spoke up, those who protested were stifled, their voices were stifled. Why? Because these imperialists wanted to have dominance. They wanted to dominate, they wanted to rule. Now, still in the area of colonialism, he says, and in the stifled laughter and victorious voice of lament. Now, while these colonialists rejoice over their dominance, over their conquest, the natives, the African natives, lament. They can't even speak up, even in their own land. They can't even fight for their rights. They are not free to do what they want. They are not free to rule themselves. They are not free to make laws or make policies that will benefit them the way they want. Instead, we have people from other lands, the Europeans, who have come to conquer and gain dominance. Moving further, it says, and in the unconscious brilliance of hidden sensations of the grieved lands of Africa. Now, looking at stanza 4, there seems to be a shift in pattern. In stanza 4, the poet is no longer focusing on the imperialism or the colonialism or the colonial masters. He's not focusing on Africa, the Africans themselves. He says, alive in themselves and with us alive. What this means is that the experiences that they had, the experiences of all this slavery and oppression is still alive in us Africans. It's still, the memories of all these experiences is still alive in us. The memories can never be erased. The memories of these bitter experiences can never be erased. No matter how Europeans try to erase these memories, it can never be erased. Why? Because Africans will continue to live to tell this story. These stories will be told from generation to generation. It is an integral part of our story as Africans. So they bubble up in dreams. These stories will continue to come up because there are dreams. We Africans are dreaming. We keep dreaming of better lives. We keep dreaming for our freedom. We keep dreaming for our independence. Decked in with dancings by baobabs over balances by the antelope in the perpetual alliance of everything that lives. Meaning that in everything we do, our dreams will be kept alive. The hope will be kept alive. We will never forgo our dreams. We will never forget our experiences. The bitter experiences of oppression and slavery is a very meaningful part of our growth as Africans. We know where we are coming from. We know what we have been through. We tell our stories. These stories are stories that would even outlive those who fought for independence. These stories will outlive those who protested, those who spoke up, those who fought valiantly for our rights. In stanza 5, it says, they shout out the sound of life. Shout it. Even the corpses thrown up by the Atlantic in putrid offering of incoherence and death, and in the clearness of rivers. Now, these people that fought for our independence are people who, the people that fought for independence were murdered. Some of them were jailed, some of them were murdered by these Europeans, and then their bodies were thrown into the oceans. He says here, they shout out the sound of life. So these corpses continue to shout out the sound of life. And what is this life? The life here refers to freedom. The life here refers to independence. The life here refers to our rights. So they continue, even their spirits will continue to sing it. Even their spirits will continue to speak and fight. So as these stories are told, they continue to shout out the sound of life. It says, even the corpses thrown up by the Atlantic in putrid offering of incoherence and death in the clearness of rivers. So this stanza refers to how people, that the heroes of the past, the heroes that fought for independence, some of them were murdered, some of them were slaughtered, and their bodies were thrown into the Atlantic Ocean. So he's saying that these bodies, the voices of these people will continue to shout for freedom, will continue to shout through those who are still alive, through those who are still living, and these stories will continue to be told even though the heroes are dead. Stanza 6 says, they live, the grieved lands of Africa, in the harmonious sound of consciences, contained in the honest blood of men, in the strong desire of men, in the sincerity, in the pure and simple rightness of the stars' existence. In this stanza, the poet is making reference to the desire of every African, the dream of every African, how every African desires to live in a society where there is harmony, to live in a society where the conscience of the people is still alive, to live in a society where there is honesty, there is sincerity. This is the kind of society that they wish to live in, and this society is inspired by the Africanness, the African consciousness that is in every African blood, that is in every native of Africa. Okay. Then in stanza 7, here he says, they live, the grieved lands of Africa, because we are living. Meaning that because Africans are still alive, these stories will still be told. Because Africans are still alive, this fight will continue. The memories still live on. The memories of what we passed through, the memories of what happened many years ago, the memories of both the ancient slavery and the colonial slavery, and even the neocolonialism that is still going on in Africa still lives. And because we are still alive, we'll continue to tell this story, because the lands of Africa still exist. Even though there is seemingly, we have something that looks like independence in most of the lands of Africa, we will still keep on fighting for total independence. And because we are living, because we still have people who are fighting for this independence, it says, and are imperishable particles. So these people, these African nations, are imperishable no matter what happens, no matter how the Europeans want to gain dominance and stifle our voices. The African lands are imperishable particles of the grieved lands of Africa. So these grieved lands of Africa, even though we are still grieving, even though the lands of Africa still grieve, but the fight for independence, the fight for freedom still continues. So generally, the poem talks about or refers to how the lands of Africa have gone through colonial oppression, through slavery, both modern slavery and both ancient slavery and modern slavery, and even both ancient slavery and modern slavery. In the case of modern slavery, we are looking at colonialism. That's also a type of slavery, and then the neo-colonialism, where most African countries, even though they have gained their independence, still have some strings attached to some of their colonial masters. So what this poem talks about is how African lands have been ripped apart, stripped of its resources, all in the name of slavery and colonialism. And the African lands still grieve. They still grieve this. They are still in grief about this whole oppression. They are still having the effects. We are still under the effects of this colonialism, of this slavery in Africa. Now let's look at some of the poetic devices that were explored by the poet in the poem. We have repetition. For example, an example of repetition in the poem is the grieved lands of Africa. This line is repeated 5 times in the poem. And then we also have of the grieved lands of Africa that is repeated about 2 times. The live is repeated about 2 times, and alive is repeated twice. Now these repetitions are used to reinforce the central message in the poem. And what is the central message in the poem? The message of suffering, the suffering that Africans went through, oppression, and then the renewed hope. The hope that we are alive, the hope that things will get better, the hope that there is still life. Okay, then we have alliteration. In the following examples, there are different sounds that are alliterated. We have degrading and dance. The sound d are alliterated in degrading and dance. We have jingling of jealous keys, laughter, laments, decked with dances, by baobabs, overbalances, sweat and seas, and then we have victorious voice. This alliteration also helps to give it a tone of musicality, to give the poem a tone of musicality, to also reinforce the message in the poem. Then we have personification. Personification is, in fact, if you look at the whole poem, we will see that personification is a major part of the poem. It runs throughout the poem. The title of the poem actually is personification. We will see that Africa itself is personified in the poem, the grieved lands of Africa. So that land is grieving is an example of personification. Then we have the wickedness of iron and fire, which is a reference to the use of ammunition to gain dominance over the lands of Africa. We have honest blood. Blood is personified by the use of honest. We have victorious voice of laments. Victorious voice of laments is an example of how, refers to how the colonial masters, even as they are victorious over their dominance or conquest of the African lands, then we have the African natives themselves are lamenting that they are being conquered and their rights are stifled. We have tearful woes, unconscious brilliance. Now these are examples of personification that the poet uses to bring his message to life. Let's look at the themes. We have the theme of oppression and slavery. As we pointed out, the major theme in this poem is that of oppression and slavery. The poem looks at how Africans were oppressed and enslaved. It talks about both especially in stanza 1, where it talks about both the ancient and modern slavery. Ancient slavery looks at how some native Africans were shipped to European countries to be used as workers by European farmers. And then we have modern slavery. The modern slavery here looks at how these European countries came into Africa, dominated Africa, and used Africa as their colonies. Now, we also have neo-colonialism. This is where most African countries are still somehow, some way or the other, attached to some of their colonial masters by means of policy and any other means. Then we have colonial imperialism. Colonial imperialism simply talks about colonization, how the European countries scrambled for Africa, partitioned, and then partitions different parts of Africa to the different countries of Europe. How some of these countries gained dominance over the lands of Africa by means of exploration and exploitation. Now, this colonialism was also brought about by means of introducing Africans to Christianity. So, by preaching to Africans, converting Africans to Christianity, they colonized and conquered African lands. Then we have grief. Grief, all throughout the poem, we will see that grief, the tone of the poet expresses grief. How? It expresses the pain, the suffering and the pain that the African heroes, some of the African heroes went through to fight for their independence. How Africans were subjected to dehumanizing conditions. It explores how Africans were subjected to dehumanizing conditions by these Europeans for their own selfish interests. How the Europeans used violence against Africans. Even in our own lands, these Europeans stifled our voices, infringed on our rights to speak up, rights to speak out. So this grief is felt in the voice of the poet persona. Then we have hope and life. If you look at the stanzas from stanzas 4 to 7, you see that the tone expresses hope and life. The tone of the poet expresses freedom, that there is freedom, that the dreams of Africans is still alive, and no matter what happens, the hope still remains, and the hope will continue to remain, even though the Europeans try to stifle our dreams. Now let's look at one of the wire questions that's the 2022 question. The question says, show how Africans suffered and survived still in show how Africans suffered and survived in Agostinho Neto's The Grieved Land. Now, one way to answer literature questions is this. Whatever question you are asked, you should make sure that you relate your questions to the theme, to one of the themes of the poem. Now, as you can see in this question, you are indirectly asked to explore the theme of suffering and oppression. So, what is expected of you is to discuss the theme of suffering or the theme of slavery and oppression in the poem. Sometimes they can twist their questions to actually know whether you've understood the poem or not. So in answering this question, the first thing you will have to look at is, having already read the poem, having mastered the lines of the poem, you should understand which part of the poem talks about suffering and enslavement. If you look at the first 3 stanzas of the poem, you'll see that there are hints or there are lines where the poet made reference to the suffering of Africans. For example, in stanza 1, he made mention of ancient and modern slavery. In stanza 2, he made mention of Africa as a flower that was crushed in the forest, and that the Europeans used the wickedness of fire and iron to enslave Africans. In discussing this question, you are expected to identify the lines in the poem where the poet has mentioned, or where the poet has made mention of suffering and oppression. So you look at stanza 1, stanza 2, stanza 3, pick up some lines from there and use them in your discussion of this question. Then, as you do that, you can also make mention of some figurative devices that the poet uses to reinforce his message, or to emphasize his message. Then you will now move down to the later part of the poem, that is stanza 4, 5, 6, and 7, where the tone of the poem seems to change to that of renewed hope, dream, and life. That is how you'll be able to answer this question.